The sun cast long shadows across the dusty plains of Arizona Territory as Margaret Greene knelt beside the small creek, blood staining her calico skirt and sleeves rolled to her elbows. The Apache boy couldn't have been more than 18 summers old, his bronze skin pale from blood loss, an ugly bullet wound torn through his shoulder. She didn't know what had possessed her to drag him to safety when she'd found him half dead by the creek, but Margaret had never been one to leave a wounded creature to die, not even one from a tribe that most settlers feared more than rattlesnakes. It was 1871, 3 years since Margaret had buried her parents in the rocky soil behind their isolated homestead. At 22, she was a woman alone in a harsh land, running a modest cattle operation with just enough livestock to keep her fed and clothed. The nearest town, Silver Creek, was half a day's ride away, and neighbors were few and far between in this remote corner of the territory. "You're going to be just fine," she murmured to the unconscious Apache, though she wasn't sure if her words were meant to reassure him or herself. The bullet had gone clean through, which was a mercy, but infection was always a danger. She tore strips from her petticoat to bandage the wound after washing it thoroughly with water from the creek. She wasn't sure how she would get him back to her cabin. He was lean but tall, and certainly too heavy for her to carry the quarter-mile. As if answering her unspoken question, his eyes fluttered open, dark and disoriented. "Can you stand?" Margaret asked, knowing he likely wouldn't understand her words. To her surprise, he nodded slightly. With considerable effort, Margaret helped him to his feet. He swayed dangerously, leaning heavily against her as they began the slow journey back to her cabin. She could feel the heat of fever already beginning to radiate from his skin. "My name is Margaret," she said as they stumbled along, partly to distract him from the pain, partly to fill the eerie silence. "Margaret Greene, I found you by the creek." The young Apache remained silent, his breathing labored, but his eyes flickered toward her face with something that might have been gratitude or suspicion. Margaret couldn't blame him if it was the latter. Relations between the Apache and settlers were strained at best, bloody at worst. By the time they reached her cabin, the sun was setting, painting the desert in hues of orange and purple. The modest structure stood alone against the backdrop of distant mountains, a single corral housing her small herd of cattle nearby. Margaret helped the wounded man inside and eased him onto her narrow bed. "I need to clean that wound properly," she told him, lighting a lamp. "It's going to hurt." The Apache watched her warily as she gathered clean cloths, a needle and thread, and a bottle of whiskey she kept for medicinal purposes. When she approached with the whiskey uncorked, he tried to sit up, only to fall back with a grimace of pain. "It's for the wound," Margaret explained, miming pouring it over his shoulder, "and maybe a little for drinking first." To her surprise, a flicker of understanding crossed his face. "Little," he said in accented but clear English. Margaret's eyebrows shot up. "You speak English?" "Some," he conceded, then winced as she helped him drink a small measure of the whiskey. "What's your name?" she asked as she prepared to clean the wound. He hesitated, as though debating whether to tell her. "Nahkohe," he finally said. "It means warrior." Margaret nodded, appreciating the significance of him sharing this. "Well, Nahkohe, you're going to need all your warrior strength now. This will hurt." When the whiskey hit his wound, Nahkohe's entire body went rigid, but he didn't cry out. Margaret worked quickly, thoroughly cleaning the injury before stitching it closed with neat, small stitches her mother had taught her to use. By the time she finished bandaging his shoulder, sweat beaded on his forehead, but his eyes remained clear and focused on her face. "Why?" he asked simply. Margaret understood the question without elaboration. Why would she, a white woman alone, help an Apache? "Because you needed help," she answered honestly. "I don't much care what tribe or race a person is when they're bleeding to death." Nahkohe studied her for a long moment before his eyes slid shut, exhaustion claiming him. Margaret covered him with a light blanket, then settled herself in the rocking chair by the hearth. She knew the risk she was taking. If any of her neighbors discovered she was harboring an Apache, particularly a young warrior, there would be trouble. But she couldn't have left him to die, and she wasn't about to turn him out now. Dawn broke with a pale golden light streaming through the cabin's small windows. Margaret had slept fitfully in the chair, waking often to check on her patient. To her relief, while Nahkohe's skin was hot with fever, it wasn't the dangerous, raging kind that often took wounded men. He slept deeply, his breathing steady. She slipped outside to tend to her small herd and fetch fresh water. The morning air was cool, but the promise of heat hung in the stillness. As she approached the corral, she noticed tracks in the dust, not her cattle's familiar prints, but those of unshod horses, Apache horses. They had circled her property sometime in the night but hadn't approached the cabin. Margaret felt a chill despite the warming air. Nahkohe wasn't alone. His people were looking for him. When she returned to the cabin, she found him awake, attempting to sit up. "You shouldn't be moving," she admonished, setting down the water bucket. "My brother," Nahkohe said, his voice strained. "Others, they look for me." "I know," Margaret replied. "I saw tracks. They came in the night." Alarm flashed across his face. "You in danger. They think you hurt me." Margaret poured water into a cup and helped him drink. "Then we should let them know I didn't. Can you stand at the door? Let them see you're alive and being cared for." Nahkohe considered this, then nodded slowly. "Tonight. They come again tonight." Throughout the day, Margaret tended to Nahkohe, feeding him broth and changing his bandages. His fever persisted, but he remained lucid. As the hours passed, he shared fragments of information. He was the son of a sub-chief. He had been scouting with 3 others when they encountered white hunters who shot without provocation, and he had become separated from his companions in the chaos that followed. "Why did you help?" He asked again as evening approached. "Most white women scream at sight of Apache." Margaret busied herself with stirring the stew she'd prepared. "My father taught me to judge people by their actions, not their birth," she said after a moment. "He was a doctor before we came west. He never turned away anyone who needed help. Your father, where is he now?" "Dead. 3 years passed. Fever took both my parents within days of each other." "You are alone," Nahkohe observed. Margaret looked up at him. "Yes, dangerous for woman alone." She offered a small, wry smile. "I manage." As darkness fell, Nahkohe insisted on moving to the door. Margaret helped him, supporting his weight as he shuffled across the cabin. The night air carried the scent of sage and distant rain as they stood in the doorway, lamplight spilling around them. For long minutes, nothing happened. Then, like shadows materializing from the darkness itself, mounted figures appeared at the edge of her property. Margaret counted 5, then 10, then more warriors on horseback, their silhouettes unmistakable against the starlit sky. "Many," Nahkohe murmured, tension evident in his voice. "How many?" Margaret whispered, her heart racing. 40, maybe 50, my father's warriors." Margaret swallowed hard. 50 Apache warriors surrounding her isolated cabin in the darkness. It was the stuff of settler nightmares. Nahkohe called out in his native tongue, his voice stronger than Margaret would have thought possible. The response came immediately, a torrent of words she couldn't understand, but the tone was clear enough, relief tinged with suspicion. One rider separated from the others, approaching the cabin at a slow walk. As he came into the pool of light from the doorway, Margaret could make out his features older than Nahkohe, with a face deeply lined by sun and experience, adorned with streaks of red paint across his cheekbones. "My father," Nahkohe said softly, "Chief Nahkohe." The chief's eyes were like obsidian as they moved from his son to Margaret, assessing, calculating. He spoke to Nahkohe, who answered at length, occasionally gesturing to Margaret. "He asks why white woman helps his son," Nahkohe translated. "I tell him you find me, save me from death." Chief Nahkohe dismounted with the fluid grace of a man half his age. He approached the doorway, stopping just outside the circle of light. He spoke directly to Margaret in heavily accented English. "My son lives because of you. Why?" Margaret met his gaze steadily. "Because it was the right thing to do." The chief studied her for a long moment before nodding once. He turned to issue commands to his warriors, and several dismounted, approaching the cabin with purposeful strides. "They take me home," Nahkohe explained, "to heal." Margaret felt a surprising pang of disappointment. "Of course, that's for the best." As the warriors prepared to take Nahkohe, the thunder of hooves broke the night's stillness. A rider approached at full gallop from the direction of town, seemingly oblivious to the Apache presence until he was nearly upon them. The warriors melted into the shadows, leaving only the chief and those nearest Nahkohe visible. The rider reined in hard, dust billowing around him. In the spill of lamplight, Margaret recognized Wade Xander, a rancher whose property bordered the northern edge of her own. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-bleached hair and a face weathered by years under the Arizona sun. At 30, he'd earned respect in Silver Creek for his fair dealings and steady hand, though Margaret knew him only in passing from her infrequent trips to town. Wade's hand hovered near the holster at his hip, eyes widening as he took in the scene. Margaret standing in her doorway with a wounded Apache, surrounded by warriors emerging from the darkness. "Miss Greene," he called, voice taut with alarm, "you all right?" "I'm fine, Mr. Xander," she replied, trying to keep her voice calm and even. "There's no trouble here." Wade's gaze darted from the chief to Nahkohe, then back to Margaret. With deliberate slowness, he dismounted, keeping his movements non-threatening but not moving his hand far from his pistol. "Looks like quite a gathering for a Tuesday night," he said, the lightness of his tone belied by the tension in his stance. Chief Nahkohe turned to face the newcomer, his expression unreadable. The warriors who had melted into the shadows now reappeared, creating a loose circle around the cabin, Wade and their leaders. Margaret felt the situation balancing on a knife's edge. "Mr. Xander, I found this young man wounded by the creek. I've been tending to him, and his people have come to take him home." Wade took this in, his blue eyes sharp in the lamplight. "I see." He turned to the chief and inclined his head slightly. "Chief Nahkohe, didn't expect to find you here." Margaret's surprise must have shown on her face, for Wade added, "We've met at the territorial peace talks last spring." The chief acknowledged this with a slight nod. "Rancher Xander, you ride far from home. Was heading back from town when I saw the gathering," Wade explained. "Thought Miss Greene might need assistance." An unsettling silence fell. Margaret was acutely aware of the dozens of warriors surrounding them, of the weight of history and conflict that made this encounter so precarious. One wrong word, one misunderstood gesture, could ignite violence. To her surprise, it was Nahkohe who broke the tension. "This woman saved my life," he said clearly, addressing both his father and Wade. "She is friend to Apache." Chief Nahkohe studied Wade for a long moment before speaking. "And you, are you friend to Apache?" Wade met the chief's gaze steadily. "I'm a friend to those who deal fairly," he said, "and an enemy to those who don't, be they white, Apache, or any other kind." A ghost of a smile touched the chief's lips. "Good answer." He turned to his warriors and issued commands in their native tongue. Several approached to help Nahkohe, supporting him as they led him toward a waiting horse. Before leaving, Nahkohe turned to Margaret. "Ahehe," he said. "Thank you. Apache will remember Margaret Greene." "Get well, Nahkohe," she replied, surprised by the emotion tightening her throat. As the Apache prepared to depart, Chief Nahkohe approached Margaret once more. "My son says you are alone. No husband, no family." Margaret nodded, unsure where this was heading. "Dangerous," the chief said, echoing his son's earlier assessment, "but Apache will not be danger to you." "This I promise." He glanced at Wade. "Perhaps not all alone now." With that cryptic remark, he mounted his horse and gave a signal. As silently as they had appeared, the warriors melted into the darkness, taking Nahkohe with them. In the sudden quiet that followed their departure, Margaret was acutely aware of Wade's presence, solid and reassuring in the doorway of her cabin. "That was quite a situation you found yourself in, Miss Greene," he said, his voice gentle with what might have been admiration. "It wasn't how I expected my evening to go," she admitted. "What brings you out this way, Mr. Xander? Silver Creek is a fair distance to ride after dark." Wade ran a hand through his hair, a surprisingly boyish gesture for a man of his size. "Was delivering some stock. Got delayed talking with the blacksmith about new shoes for my horses." He glanced in the direction the Apache had disappeared. "Lucky timing, I guess." Margaret smiled slightly. "I don't think I was in any danger. They seemed grateful." "Still, 50 Apache warriors is a sight most folks would run from, not stand beside with the door open." Wade studied her with new interest. "You're not most folks, are you, Miss Greene?" "I suppose not." She suddenly realized they were still standing in the doorway. "Would you care for some coffee, Mr. Xander? It's the least I can offer for your concern." Wade hesitated, glancing at the night sky. I should probably start back. It's a long ride in the dark, Margaret pointed out, and I've just made stew. A smile broke across his face, transforming his weathered features. Well, when you put it that way, Miss Greene, I'd be a fool to refuse. Inside the cabin, Margaret busied herself with bowls and coffee cups, grateful for the simple tasks that helped steady her still racing heart. Wade stood awkwardly near the door, hat in hand, taking in the modest but tidy interior of her home. You've kept this place up well, he observed. Can't be easy on your own. Margaret handed him a steaming bowl of stew. I manage. The cattle don't require much beyond feeding and the occasional medical attention. It's a smaller herd than what you run, I imagine. 30 head is nothing to dismiss, Wade said, surprising her with his knowledge of her operation. At her raised eyebrow, he added, small community, people talk. And what do they say about the spinster Greene woman? Margaret asked lightly, though there was a challenge in her eyes. Wade looked genuinely taken aback. Spinster, you can't be more than 22, she supplied. Hardly a spinster, he said firmly. What they say is that you're independent and capable, that you turned down 3 marriage proposals after your parents passed because you wanted to keep the ranch running your way. It was Margaret's turn to be surprised. They got the number right, at least. Wade chuckled, the sound warm in the quiet cabin. A woman who knows her own mind is something to respect, Miss Greene, not gossip about. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, the events of the evening settling around them like dust after a storm. How did you come to know Chief Nahkohe? Margaret finally asked. Wade set his empty bowl aside. Been trying to establish better relations between the ranchers and the Apache for a couple years now. Less fighting means more time for building something worthwhile out here. He shrugged. Not everyone sees it that way, of course. No, Margaret agreed softly. They don't. Wade studied her across the small table. What made you help the boy? The question was simple, but Margaret sensed its importance. I could not help him, she said after a moment. He was hurt alone. I didn't see an Apache, I saw someone who needed help. Something shifted in Wade's expression, respect, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit. That's rare thinking in these parts. My father was the same way. When we first came west, he treated anyone who needed it, settlers, soldiers, natives, said medicine didn't recognize boundaries drawn on maps. Sounds like a wise man. He was. Margaret pushed away the familiar ache of loss. What about your family, Mr. Xander? You mentioned your ranch, but not whether you share it with anyone. Wade shook his head. Just me and a couple of hands. My parents are back East Philadelphia. They think I've lost my mind coming out here to raise cattle. A smile tugged at his mouth. Maybe they're right. Yet here you are. Here I am. His eyes, blue as a summer sky, held hers. And at the moment, nowhere I'd rather be. The statement hung between them, simple but laden with meaning. Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks and busied herself with collecting their dishes. It's getting late, she said, suddenly aware of the impropriety of entertaining a man alone in her cabin at night, even under such unusual circumstances. You have a long ride ahead. Wade rose to his feet. That I do. He settled his hat on his head. Miss Greene, would you allow me to call on you properly? Perhaps Sunday after church services. The invitation was unexpected but not unwelcome. Margaret found herself nodding before she'd fully considered her answer. I'd like that, Mr. Xander. Wade, he corrected gently. If we're to be friends, you might as well use my given name. Margaret, then, she replied, liking the way his name felt on her lips. He paused at the door, framed against the night sky. You did a brave thing today, Margaret. Not many would have had the courage. I'm not sure it was courage so much as stubbornness, she admitted. But thank you. Wade's smile crinkled the corners of his eyes. Stubbornness can be a fine quality in the right circumstances. He tipped his hat. Sunday, then. After he'd gone, Margaret stood in the doorway watching until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the night. The events of the day seemed almost dreamlike now, the wounded Apache boy, the warriors surrounding her home, Wade appearing like something out of a dime novel. Yet the memory of his smile, the warmth in his eyes when he'd asked to call on her, those felt very real indeed. Sunday couldn't come soon enough. The days passed in a blur of routine chores. though Margaret found herself glancing more often toward the northern border of her property, where Wade's much larger ranch lay. On Saturday, she spent extra time washing her hair and pressing her best dress, a simple blue cotton that her mother had always said brought out the color of her eyes. When Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, Margaret hitched her horse to the small buggy she used for trips to town. Silver Creek was stirring to life as she arrived, storekeepers opening their doors and families making their way toward the white clapboard church at the end of the main street. Margaret received more than a few curious glances as she tied her horse at the hitching post. News traveled fast in small towns, and she suspected that Wade's presence at her cabin might already be common knowledge. The thought made her cheeks warm. Inside the church, she slipped into a pew near the back, nodding politely to Mrs. Peterson and her 3 daughters. She just settled her skirts when a shadow fell across the hymnal in her hands. Looking up, she found Wade standing in the aisle, hat in hand, looking surprisingly formal in a clean white shirt and dark jacket. "Miss Greene," he said, his voice carrying in the quiet church, "might I join you?" Aware of the eyes upon them, Margaret nodded, making room on the wooden bench. Wade settled beside her, his large frame making the pew seem suddenly smaller. "You look lovely," he murmured, pitching his voice for her ears alone. "Thank you," she replied, keeping her eyes fixed on the hymnal to hide her pleasure at the compliment. The service proceeded as it always did, Reverend Miller's sermon meandering through biblical passages, with occasional sharp turns into warnings about the moral dangers of frontier life. Through it all, Margaret was hyper-aware of Wade beside her, their arms occasionally brushing when they rose for hymns or sat for prayers. When the service ended, they joined the congregation spilling out into the sunlight. Several people stopped to greet them, their curiosity thinly veiled behind pleasantries. "Thought we might take a walk," Wade suggested when they'd finally extricated themselves. "Weather's fine and I packed a lunch basket in my wagon." Margaret hesitated only briefly. "That sounds lovely. Let me just tell Mrs. Peterson I won't be joining her for Sunday dinner as planned." After making her excuses, Margaret returned to find Wade waiting with his wagon, a handsome bay team harnessed and ready. He helped her up to the seat, his hands strong and sure at her waist, lingering perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary. They drove out of town, following a creek that wound through cottonwoods and willows. The conversation flowed easily between them, talk of cattle prices, the dry spring, local gossip. When they reached a particularly pretty spot where the creek widened into a pool, Wade brought the wagon to a halt. "Thought this might be a good place to stop," he said, jumping down and coming around to help her descend. "Used to fish here when I first arrived in the territory, peaceful spot." Margaret breathed in the scent of water and green things, a welcome change from the dusty air of her ranch. "It's beautiful." Wade spread a blanket beneath a cottonwood and unpacked his basket: bread, cheese, apples, and even a bottle of cider. As they ate, the conversation turned more personal. "How long have you been in Arizona territory?" Margaret asked. 5 years this October," Wade replied. "Came out with nothing but a dream of open spaces and a handful of seed cattle. Been building slowly since then. And your ranch now, 200 head, give or take, good grazing land, enough water most years." He looked at her curiously. "What about you?" "Your parents brought you west when you were young," Margaret nodded. "I was 16 when we left Pennsylvania. My father had been a doctor in Philadelphia, but mother's health was poor. The doctors recommended dry air." A sad smile touched her lips. "Ironic that they both died of fever after surviving the journey west." Wade's hand covered hers briefly. "I'm sorry." "It was 3 years ago," she said, though the loss still ached. "I've made my peace with it. Still, to be left alone so young, it couldn't have been easy." "It wasn't," she admitted, "but I had choices. I could have sold the ranch, gone back east to relatives. I could have accepted one of those marriage proposals you mentioned." She looked out over the water. "But this land gets in your blood, doesn't it? The vastness of it, the freedom." Wade's eyes were warm when she turned back to him. "It surely does." In the dappled shade of the cottonwood, with the sound of water murmuring nearby, Margaret felt a connection to this man that went beyond the unusual circumstances of their meeting. There was something solid about Wade Xander, something trustworthy. Yet he didn't seem to find her independence threatening, as so many men did. "Tell me," he said, leaning back against the tree trunk, "if you had accepted one of those proposals, which lucky fellow would be calling you wife today?" Margaret laughed. None of them felt right. Thomas Miller, the reverend's son, offered marriage 2 weeks after the funeral. I think he believed he was rescuing me. She wrinkled her nose. I didn't want to be rescued. Then there was Harold Porter, who owns the general store. And the third. James Davidson, she said with a slight grimace. He has the big spread east of town. Made it very clear he was interested in my land, not me. Wade shook his head. Man's a fool then. The land's fine, but it's the woman working it that's truly remarkable. The compliment brought warmth to Margaret's cheeks. She wasn't used to such directness. And what about you, Wade? No proposals of your own, he chuckled. Can't say I've been on the receiving end of any. That's not what I meant, she chided gently. I know. His smile faded into something more thoughtful. Truth is, I've been too busy building something to think much about sharing it, until recently. The implication hung in the air between them, neither addressing it directly but both aware of its presence. After their picnic, they walked along the creek, talking of lighter things, books they'd read, music they enjoyed, childhood memories. Wade told her about Philadelphia winters and how he still wasn't used to Christmas without snow. Margaret shared stories of her father's medical practice and how he'd taught her basic skills that had served her well in the isolated territory. The sun was beginning its westward descent when they finally returned to the wagon. Wade helped her up, then paused, still holding her hand. Margaret, he said, his voice low and serious, I'd like to continue calling on you if you're agreeable. She looked down at their joined hands, his large and sun-darkened, her smaller but no less work-worn. I'd like that very much, Wade. The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise. Good, that's good. On the drive back to town, they sat closer together on the wagon seat, their shoulders touching companionably. By the time they reached Margaret's buggy, the sun was setting, painting the buildings of Silver Creek in gold and rose. I'll see you home, Wade offered, but Margaret shook her head. I've been making this drive alone for 3 years, she reminded him. Besides, your ranch is in the opposite direction. Wade looked like he wanted to argue but respected her decision. At least let me follow you to the edge of town. She agreed to this compromise, and they parted at the crossroads with the promise to meet again soon. As Margaret drove home in the gathering dusk, she felt lighter than she had in years, as though some burden she hadn't even recognized had been lifted from her shoulders. Over the next few weeks, Wade became a regular visitor at Margaret's ranch. Sometimes he would ride over in the evening after finishing his own chores, staying just long enough to share a meal and conversation. Other times, he would appear midday with tools in hand, offering to help with repairs to her corral or the leaky roof that had plagued her since spring. Margaret found herself looking forward to these visits with an eagerness that both delighted and alarmed her. She had grown accustomed to her independence, to answering to no one but herself. Yet Wade never made her feel as though he was encroaching on that independence. Rather, he seemed to respect and admire it. One evening in late June, they sat on her porch watching a spectacular sunset paint the desert in vivid oranges and purples. Wade had brought a bottle of wine from town, a small luxury that they sipped from mismatched cups as the colors deepened across the sky. I ran into Chief Nahkohe at the trading post yesterday, Wade said, breaking a comfortable silence. Margaret turned to him with interest. How is Nahkohe? Recovered according to his father. The chief asked after you. Wade took a sip of his wine. I think you made quite an impression. I'm glad Nahkohe is well, Margaret said sincerely. It's strange if I hadn't found him that day, you and I might never have met. Wade contemplated this. Maybe. Or maybe we would have, just in a different way. He shifted on the porch step to face her more directly. I'd noticed you in town before, at church or the general store. Always thought you seemed different from other women. Different how? Margaret asked, both curious and wary. More alive, he said simply. Like you were fully present in your life, not just waiting for it to begin with marriage or for someone else to make decisions for you. Margaret was touched by his perception. My father always said I was born knowing my own mind. It's a quality I admire, Wade said, his voice dropping lower. Among many others. The intensity of his gaze made Margaret's heart quicken. They had been careful these past weeks, maintaining the propriety expected of a courting couple. But in this moment, with night falling around them and no one to see for miles, the boundaries seemed to be blurring, slowly, telegraphing his intentions. Wade set his cup aside and reached for her hand. His fingers were calloused from ranch work but gentle as they enfolded hers. "Margaret," he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant, "I need to tell you something." She waited, suddenly afraid he was about to reveal some hidden aspect of himself that would shatter the connection growing between them. "The night we met, when I found you surrounded by Apache warriors, I told you I was coming from town after delivering stock." He paused. "That wasn't entirely true." Margaret withdrew her hand slightly. "What do you mean?" "I was coming to see you," Wade admitted. Had been working up the courage for weeks. That evening, I finally decided it was time to introduce myself properly. Relief washed through her, followed quickly by confusion. "Why not just say so?" Wade ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign of discomfort. "Wasn't sure how you'd take to the idea of me riding out specifically to see you. Thought you might think it presumptuous." A small laugh escaped her. "You faced down 50 Apache warriors without blinking, but you were afraid of my reaction to a social call." His answering smile was sheepish. "When you put it that way, it does sound foolish." "Not foolish," Margaret corrected gently. "Sweet." In the deepening twilight, with crickets beginning their evening chorus and the first stars appearing overhead, Wade leaned forward. His hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch feather light, giving her every opportunity to pull away. Margaret didn't pull away. Instead, she closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that was tentative at first, then grew in confidence as Wade's arms slipped around her waist, drawing her closer. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Wade rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since the moment I saw you standing in your doorway, brave as any frontier legend." Margaret smiled, her heart full to bursting. "I believe I've been wanting it too, though I might not have admitted it even to myself." They sat together as full darkness settled over the desert, talking quietly of small things, occasionally exchanging kisses that grew increasingly difficult to end. Finally, Wade stood reluctantly. "I should head back," he said, though his expression made it clear he'd rather stay. "People will talk if I'm here too late." "People already talk," Margaret pointed out, rising to stand beside him. "Mrs. Peterson asked me just yesterday when we'd be making an announcement." Wade's eyebrows shot up. "An announcement?" "Of our engagement," Margaret clarified, feeling her cheeks warm. "I told her she was being presumptuous." Wade took her hands in his expression suddenly serious. "Would it be presumptuous, I mean?" Margaret's breath caught. "Wade, I'm not asking, not yet," he hastened to add. "But I want you to know that's where my thoughts are heading, Margaret Greene." The simple honesty of his statement touched her deeply. "Mine too," she admitted softly. He kissed her once more, deeply and thoroughly, before finally pulling away with visible reluctance. "Sunday," he promised. "I'll see you at church." Margaret watched him ride away, a dark silhouette against the star-strewn sky, and felt a happiness so profound it was almost painful. For 3 years, she had convinced herself that independence was enough, that the solitary life she'd built was fulfilling. Now she realized what had been missing: not someone to rescue her or take over her life, but a partner to share it with. Sunday's church service seemed interminable. Margaret was acutely conscious of Wade beside her, of the secret knowledge they shared of kisses exchanged and feelings acknowledged. When Reverend Miller finally brought the sermon to a close, she was among the first to rise. Outside in the bright sunlight, Wade took her arm in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. Several knowing glances were exchanged among the townsfolk, but Margaret found she didn't mind. Let them talk. For once, the gossip contained a kernel of truth. They had just reached Wade's wagon when a commotion at the far end of the street caught their attention. A rider was approaching at a gallop, raising dust that gleamed golden in the midday sun. As he drew nearer, Margaret recognized one of Wade's ranch hands, a young man named Timothy. "Mr. Xander," he called, reining in sharply. Trouble at the ranch, sir. Apache. Wade's body tensed beside her. What kind of trouble? Timothy glanced nervously at the gathered churchgoers who were now watching with undisguised interest. 50 or more, sir. Came across the north pasture not an hour ago. Rogers sent me to fetch you. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. 50 Apache warriors was no small matter, especially with memories of past raids still fresh in many minds. Are they armed? Wade asked, his voice level despite the tension evident in his stance. Yes, sir, but they ain't attacking, just waiting like. Rogers said the chief asked for you by name. Margaret's hand tightened on Wade's arm. Nahkohe, she said quietly. Wade nodded, his expression grim. Likely. Sheriff Davis pushed through the gathered townsfolk. Xander, you want a posse? I can have 20 men ready to ride in 15 minutes. No, Wade said firmly. No posse, these aren't hostiles. 50 armed Apache ain't hostiles. Someone called incredulously. Wade's jaw tightened. If they wanted trouble, they wouldn't be waiting for me to talk. They'd have already attacked. He turned to Timothy. Ride back. Tell Rogers I'm on my way and to keep everyone calm. As the young ranch hand galloped off, Wade turned to Margaret. I need to go. I'm coming with you, she said immediately. Wade shook his head. Too dangerous. If it's Nahkohe, my presence might help, Margaret insisted. He knows me. Trusts me because of Nahkohe. Several of the townspeople were watching their exchange with undisguised interest, and Sheriff Davis looked increasingly determined to form his posse regardless of Wade's wishes. Margaret could see the moment Wade realized she was right. Having her along might help diffuse whatever situation was brewing. All right, he conceded, but you stay back if there's any sign of trouble. They departed immediately, leaving behind a buzz of speculation. Wade's wagon moved swiftly along the road north, his usually gentle handling of the reins replaced by urgent commands to the team. What do you think they want? Margaret asked as they crested a hill that offered the first view of his ranch in the distance. Wade shook his head. Could be anything. Water rights, a misunderstanding with my men, or something to do with Nahkohe. He glanced at her. I'm glad you're here, but I want your word you'll be careful. I give you my word, she promised, but I think this is about something else entirely. Before Wade could question her further, they arrived at the outskirts of his property. From this vantage point, they could see the Apache gathered in the north pasture, their horses forming a loose semicircle facing the ranch house. Wade's ranch hand's 6 men in total stood nervously on the porch, rifles at the ready but not aimed. Wade brought the wagon to a halt a safe distance away. Stay here until I signal, he told Margaret. If anything happens, take the reins and get back to town as fast as you can. Margaret nodded, though she had no intention of abandoning him. She watched as Wade approached the gathered warriors on foot, his stride purposeful but non-threatening, hands visible at his sides. Chief Nahkohe separated from his men, riding forward to meet Wade halfway. Even at a distance, Margaret could see the chief's formal attire elaborate beadwork, feathers, and paint that marked this as no ordinary visit. Beside him rode a younger warrior whom Margaret recognized with a start. Nahkohe, fully recovered and sitting tall on his pinto horse. The conversation between Wade and the chief was too distant to hear, but their body language suggested tension rather than imminent violence. After several minutes, Wade turned and signaled for Margaret to join them. Heart pounding, she climbed down from the wagon and walked across the sun-baked earth to where the men waited. As she approached, Nahkohe's face broke into a smile of recognition. Margaret Greene, Chief Nahkohe greeted her in his deep, accented voice. My son said you would be with the rancher. Chief Nahkohe, she replied, inclining her head respectfully. I'm glad to see Nahkohe recovered. The young Apache touched his shoulder where her stitches had been. Good medicine, he said simply. Wade stood beside her, his expression guarded but not hostile. The chief says they've come about the water rights to Cedar Creek, he explained. It runs through both our lands and the reservation. Margaret understood immediately. Cedar Creek was a vital water source in the dry season, which was fast approaching. Rights to its water had been a point of contention between settlers and the Apache for years. What does he propose? She asked. Wade's eyebrows rose slightly at her directness, but he seemed to appreciate it. A treaty, shared access with specific days allocated to each party. "And you're willing to consider this?" Margaret asked, knowing many ranchers would reject any such arrangement outright. "I am," Wade confirmed. "It's a fair solution." Chief Nahkohe had been watching their exchange with interest. "The woman understands," he said to Wade. "She has wisdom." "She does," Wade agreed, the warmth in his voice unmistakable. The chief's obsidian eyes moved from Wade to Margaret and back again. "You have formed a bond since we last met," he observed. Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks but didn't deny it. Wade's hand found hers, a public declaration of their relationship. "We have," Wade acknowledged. A rare smile touched the chief's weathered face. "Good. The woman who saved my son deserves a warrior worthy of her courage." He gestured to Nahkohe, who dismounted and approached with a small bundle wrapped in soft deerskin. "A gift," Nahkohe explained, holding it out to Margaret, "for your kindness." Margaret accepted the bundle with both hands, unwrapping it carefully to reveal a beautifully crafted silver and turquoise bracelet, its design intricate and obviously valuable. "It's beautiful," she breathed, "but I can't accept such a precious gift." "You must," Nahkohe said firmly. "It is made by my wife's hands to honor the one who returned our son to us." Understanding the cultural significance of the gift, Margaret nodded her acceptance. "I am honored." As Nahkohe returned to his horse, the chief addressed Wade once more. "We will talk of water tomorrow, bring her." He indicated Margaret with a nod. "Her presence brings good medicine to difficult words." With that, he raised a hand in a signal to his warriors. As silently as they had appeared, the Apache departed, leaving a cloud of dust and a profound sense of possibility in their wake. Wade's ranch hands approached cautiously once the Apache were gone, their expressions a mixture of relief and confusion. "Everything all right, boss?" Rogers, the foreman, asked. "Better than all right," Wade replied. "We may have just avoided the water dispute we've been worrying about all spring." He turned to Margaret with a smile that made her heart skip. "Thanks to you." "I didn't do anything," she protested. "You did everything," Wade corrected. "If you hadn't saved Nahkohe, if you hadn't insisted on coming with me today, this could have gone very differently." The ranch hands dispersed to tend to their duties, leaving Wade and Margaret standing in the golden afternoon light. The bracelet from Nahkohe gleamed in her hands, a tangible symbol of the unexpected connections that had formed since that fateful day by the creek. Wade took her hands in his, careful of the precious gift she held. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low and intimate despite the open space around them, "about what you said yesterday about people already talking." Margaret met his gaze steadily. "Yes." "Let them talk," Wade said, drawing her closer. "Better yet, let's give them something real to talk about." Before she could respond, he was kneeling in the dust before her, still holding her hands, his blue eyes earnest and unwavering. "Margaret Greene, I knew you were extraordinary the moment I saw you standing in your doorway, facing down 50 Apache warriors without flinching. Every day since has only confirmed that first impression." His voice deepened with emotion. "I love your courage, your kindness, your independence. I love that you saved Nahkohe not because it was safe or sensible, but because it was right. I love that you're not looking for someone to rescue you, which is fortunate, because today you're the one who rescued me." A smile touched his lips. "I love you, Margaret. Will you marry me?" Margaret looked down at this man kneeling before her, this good, honest man who valued her strength instead of trying to diminish it, who saw her as a partner rather than a possession. The answer rose to her lips without hesitation. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and certain. "Yes, Wade Xander, I will marry you." Wade rose to his feet, pulling her into an embrace that lifted her off the ground. His kiss was joyful and passionate, heedless of the watching ranch hands who broke into spontaneous applause and whoops of approval. When he finally set her down, they were both laughing, giddy with happiness and the promise of a future together. "When?" Wade asked, pushing a strand of hair from her face with gentle fingers. "Soon," Margaret replied. "I see no reason to wait." Wade's smile was radiant, "Nor do I." They were married 2 weeks later in the Silver Creek Church, with Reverend Miller officiating and the entire town in attendance. The ceremony was traditional, but there was one unexpected addition to the gathering at the back of the church. Standing respectfully but unmistakably present were Chief Nahkohe and Nahkohe, their appearance causing a stir among the townsfolk. Margaret, radiant in a cream-colored dress that had been her mother's, felt only gratitude for their presence. It seemed fitting that those who had inadvertently brought her and Wade together should witness their union. After the ceremony, as they greeted their guests outside the church, Nahkohe approached them. He carried a small bundle similar to the one Nahkohe had presented to Margaret weeks earlier. "For new beginnings," the chief said, extending the gift to Wade. Inside was a pair of intricately beaded moccasins and a small silver medallion on a leather cord. The significance wasn't lost on Wade, who accepted the gifts with genuine appreciation. "You honor us," he said, bowing his head slightly. "No," Nahkohe replied. "You honor yourselves by walking a new path." He looked between them, his expression solemn. "Not all white men would share water with Apache. Not all white women would save Apache boy. You are different. Perhaps you make difference for others, too." With that profound hope hanging in the air, the chief and his son departed, leaving the wedding guests abuzz with excitement at having witnessed such an unprecedented interaction. The celebration continued at Wade's ranch, now their ranch, with food, music, and dancing that lasted well into the night. As darkness fell, Wade led Margaret away from the festivities to the newly built porch of their home. "Happy, Mrs. Xander?" he asked, drawing her into the circle of his arms. Margaret leaned into his embrace, feeling the solid strength of him against her. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she admitted, "though I might keep the Greene name for the cattle business. Margaret Greene has a certain reputation for quality stock." Wade laughed, the sound rumbling pleasantly against her cheek. "Whatever you want. I didn't marry you to change who you are." Margaret tilted her face up to his. "And that, Wade Xander, is why I married you." His kiss was tender, a promise of all the days and nights to come. Around them, the desert stretched vast and beautiful under the starry sky, the land they both loved and would build a life upon together. As they returned to their guests hand in hand, Margaret reflected on the strange, wonderful journey that had brought her to this moment. A wounded Apache boy, 50 warriors, and a cowboy brave enough to stand beside her, these were the unlikely beginnings of a love that now seemed as vast and enduring as the Arizona sky above them. 1 year later, Margaret stood on the porch of their home, watching as Wade rode in from checking the north pasture. Her hand rested lightly on her rounded belly, their first child due before winter set in. The ranch had prospered under their joint care, their herds combining and multiplying, their reputation for fair dealings extending to both settlers and Apache alike. The water-sharing treaty Wade had negotiated with Chief Nahkohe had become a model for other ranchers in the territory, though not all were quick to embrace such cooperation. Change came slowly to the frontier, but it did come one conversation, one act of kindness, one shared resource at a time. As Wade dismounted and strode toward her, his face lighting up at the sight of her waiting, Margaret felt a profound gratitude for the twists of fate that had brought them together. Her decision to help a wounded boy, his choice to stand beside her when 50 warriors surrounded her cabin, these simple acts of humanity had created something beautiful and lasting. Wade's hand joined hers over their growing child. "How are my two favorite people today?" he asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Waiting for you," Margaret replied, leaning into his embrace, "always waiting for you to come home." And as the sun set over their land, painting the desert in hues of gold and crimson, Margaret knew that this love, this partnership, this life they were building together was more than she had ever dared to dream of when she'd been a woman alone. It was, quite simply, everything.